Welcome to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Today, I'm very honored to be joined by Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly. Um, it's really, we've, so there's a story, I don't know if we'll talk about this, but there is another conversation that we had about a year ago that we may release to patrons only. But anyway, just needless to say, this is the first time that we're having a conversation that we're releasing about this book, which in itself is a bit of a tragedy. And so I'm excited that we get to remedy that today. And so anyway, there's so much to talk about, and obviously the book was really relevant in the moment that it was released. And I feel like in this current moment, there are so many ways in which maybe we can point out the relevancy of it even more. And so really excited to have this conversation. Make sure to take a minute, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you have not already, and go into the show description if you aren't following the work at LSR over on Black Liberation Media. Please do that, and the work that Dr. Burden-Stelly does with Layla Brown there, which is excellent. And yeah, I mean, what else to say? What else to say? I mean, obviously, folks know Charisse Burden-Stelly is a Black Studies scholar of political theory, political economy, intellectual history, and political and historical sociology. We're going to be talking about the book Black Scare, Red Scare, Theorizing Capitalist Racism in the United States. And she's the author or co-editor of a number of other books, including Organized Fight Win, Black Communist Women's Political Writings, and Reproducing Dominion on the Caribbean and Post-Colonial State. And there's a bunch of other stuff. I'm gonna leave it there and welcome Charisse to the stage. It's good to be with you again, Charisse.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, it's truly an honor, and I'm excited to have this discussion. So, there's a bunch of stuff that we can go through in this book and talk about, and we'll do some of that today for sure. But part of why I reached out to you for this conversation is that amid all of these different forms of state repression that we're seeing right now, whether it's against pro-Palestine activists or anti-Zionist activists, anti-imperialists in this moment, where we're amid a U.S.-Israeli genocidal war on Palestinians in Gaza. I think your book really helps theorize and make sense of how the U.S. state responds to ideas and movements that it constitutes as threats. And of course, the perceived threats are not limited just to Palestinians, right? And obviously, in your book, you're looking at, the Red Scare and the Black Scare, and thinking about how communists and Black people constitute specific threats to the order as well. And we'll get into some of the specifics as well of that. But along the way, you look at the ways the judicial system is used, the immigration system in terms of naturalization and denaturalization and more. And I just wanted to start by kind of saying, as you're seeing all that's going on right now, whether it's how universities are behaving in this moment, or how multiple levers of state power are being used to suppress speech and to deport or detain folks because the ideas they express and actions that they take, what has gone through your mind with respect to this book that you released at the end of 2023 and obviously worked on for many years leading up to that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thank you. And I just, before I start, I beseech your grace, audience, if I'm turning around or if my child is asleep behind me, so if I have to grab her, I'll grab her, but she's very cute. So you're in for a treat if that happens. Well, the first thing I want to mention is that part of what I do in my book is talk about how all three branches of government are architects of the Black Scare and the Red Scare. And so we really see that in this current moment of repression, right? And so, for example, we have the executive orders that are coming down from the Trump administration about all kinds of things, but especially immigration and immigration that is fundamentally predicated on deporting undesirables. So whether this is pro-Palestinian liberation activists, whether it's ostensible criminals from places that are seen as enemies of the United States, like Venezuela, we really see the powerful use of executive orders. And of course, in 1947, the Cold War really kicked off with the issuance of an executive order by the Truman administration about loyalty oaths, right? And then that sort of set to work all sorts of other anti-communist architecture. In terms of the legislative branch, along with various bills that are being introduced about anti-Semitism that really have to do with disciplining pro-Palestinian activism, and how that has been completely contemporaneous with the attack on DEI, which I'll talk about more later. But then we also have these resolutions that are passed by these resolutions and censures that are happening within both chambers of Congress that, again, have to do with punishing people who have anything positive to say about Palestine. And then we have, of course, these committees that are calling forth these university administrators to do all sorts of things. Number one, to make them offer really what is an impossible or untenable defense of combating anti-Semitism, because as we know, this is really not about anti-Semitism. And then with respect to the courts, the courts always act through action and inaction. So whether it's the Supreme Court refusing to hear particular cases that would allow people to stay in the country, or whether it's judiciaries at different levels, like federal courts upholding aspects of Trump's policy. There are some who are issuing temporary conjunctions, but this in and of itself is sort of capitulation, right? It's not making a firm stand, but it's sort of stopping the bleeding for just a second, generally speaking, in response to public opinion. So that's the first thing, all three branches of government. The second thing is sort of Cold War liberalism and its progeny. We're seeing the ways that liberals are really upholding the status quo through their milquetoast, lily-livered, very weak contestations, or as you know, one Democratic writer put it, rolling over and playing dead. And so we saw, for example, these protests that were happening that were not about Gaza, but that were about defending NATO. So these people are really about reproducing the status quo, but in ways that don't menace their own particular position. We see this through these people trying to say Trump is some sort of communist, or linking him to Russia, but with symbols of communist Russia, even though there's nothing communist about Russia. And so the same type of discourse. And then defense of imperialist tools like USAID. Right. And so really, shoring up defenses of U.S. imperialist soft power. And this is very much part and parcel of the Cold War liberal strategy as well. Just two more things. One is so anti-Semitism is the new communism, right? In terms of how it's being weaponized to abrogate freedoms and liberties. And so in my book, when I talk about communism, what I say is that communism means communism, but it means many other things. It means anything that defies the pedagogy of the state, anything that challenges reigning U.S. domestic and foreign policy, anything that can be considered on the sort of constitutive outside of the U.S. state. And now anti-Semitism is doing that precise work. It is being abstracted from its core meaning to mean anybody who critiques Israel, right? Anybody who participates in pro-Palestinian liberation. And it is very closely linked with this idea that there are too many colors and too many foreigners on college and university campuses. And it's very closely linked to anti-intellectualism. So this protracted attack on the university in particular. And so this is how communism was weaponized as well. The last thing that I'll talk about, so I have a section I want to read. I actually won't read it because I can come back to it later. But the second is the sort of invoking of and resonance with a bevy of legislation I talk about in my book from the Espionage Act of 1917, which was invoked by President Trump, which actually cannot be used. In fact, because the Espionage Act is a wartime bill, the Attorney General of that time, Attorney General Palmer, was trying to get a peacetime anti-sedition bill passed, but he couldn't. This is what allowed for the anti-communist apparatus or anti-radical apparatus to redound to the states. And it didn't sort of get back federal momentum until the passing of the first peacetime anti-sedition bill or anti-subversion bill, which was the Smith Act of 1940. But then there's also the 1952 McCarran-Walter Act that has also been directly invoked. I won't go too much into it. I have a whole thing about it, but basically, it is the McCarran-Walter Act that is allowing for people to be punished, deported, incarcerated, etc., for ideas, and the conflation of ideas and acts. It has part of it is about like registration, people having to register, and all of these things we're seeing reappear in various stages now. And so all of those things from the book that I talk about in great detail are sort of have prepared me for this moment, and will prepare folks for the moment if they read it.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I read it in 2023, and I read it again in the last couple of weeks to prepare for this conversation, and I really felt like I was kind of reading it in new eyes of like, oh yeah, that's going on right now, for sure. And it's that's really interesting too, the point you made about anti-Semitism as the new communism, especially, when you think about the history of, anti-communism and anti-Semitism going back in the period, the Judeo-Bolshevik anti-Semitism that was going on in that time. And, the shift too, like we had on Adnan Hussein the other day, and he was talking about we don't get the term Judeo-Christian civilization until the 1950s, because it couldn't happen until the establishment of the state of Israel and until, post-World War II kind of moment, and this acceptance of Jewish people playing a specific role, but in Israel, not so much in Europe or in the United States. And so, yeah, it's kind of wild to think about that whole trajectory that we could see, where now it would be in this moment where it would be used as a specific attack against, radicalism, framed as anti-Semitism rather than Semitic attacks against radicalism.
Ironically, that same historical moment in the same sort of pretext is when we get the term racism, right? That is when the term racism comes into like popular parlance. There's much to say about that, but anyway.
That's awesome. That's fascinating. So, before we go further, I know, I think we've talked to you about this term before. I know others have, but there's a term that you use, the structural location of Blackness. And I just feel like it's really important to how you analyze the Black Scare and the relationship that it has to Wall Street imperialism and true Americanism, which are both terms that we should probably talk about a little bit too. And I also just think beyond this idea of, beyond just a structural location of Blackness, like thinking about a structural location in relation to racisms, I think is helpful sometimes in helping us to kind of better analyze, when and where racisms are animated in pursuit of a kind of specific project or specific politics. So can you talk a little bit about just what you mean by the term, the structural location of Blackness, and perhaps a bit about why it is important to your overall analysis within this book and beyond too, I'm sure.
Yeah, so I'm just going to read this little section, if you'll indulge me, just so to give people a sort of idea of the denotation. So the structural location of Blackness is a relationship that inscribes an inferiorized condition, a disempowered status, and a subordinated emplacement in society. It's an essential source of super profit and the manifold discursive configurations that preserve and legitimate racial hierarchy through cross-class alliance between capitalists and workers that is forged by a commitment to white supremacy. It exceeds the category of race, is not reducible to class, and does not fit the specifications of caste. And so that's the important part there. It's an alternative to a sort of ontological understanding of Blackness that's put forth by Afro-pessimists, as well as the sort of caste understanding that's put forth by Black liberals. And so structural location is thinking about how a relationship to the capitalist mode of production, national oppression, right, the specific form of oppression that internally colonized people experience, and then all of the discursive apparatus that sort of both obfuscates and legitimates that reality, how those co-constitute. And so I go on to say, whereas in the political economy of U.S. capitalism, race describes a social status determined by capitalist relations of production, structural location describes a material relationship sustained through a combination of political, economic, and discursive processes that, when challenged, threaten to upend the total organization of U.S. society. And also, like, structural location of Blackness has a class basis insofar as it exists within a capitalist society. But it is not reducible to a class relationship because it has generally served as a source of cross-class collaboration between whites, what Du Bois has called democratic despotism, not least to the ideology of white supremacy. And then the structural location of Blackness also facilitates cross-class solidarity among Black people over and against interracial class solidarity at times, given at the same time it encompasses intraracial class conflict that reifies and intensifies the super exploitation of Black workers, albeit at different intensity. And so to make a short story long, basically what I'm trying to do with structural location of Blackness is to think about a relationship to the capitalist mode of production, imperialism as the source of anti-Black racial oppression, and that there is a sort of political ontology to Blackness, but that it is inseparable from political economy, that these things co-constitute. And so I think it's important to think about this in this moment because too often, whether it's through like the caste trap or through other ideologies, we are thinking about, number one, racism as thoughts, behaviors, individual actions, or attitudes, or on the other hand, as this intractable thing that sort of outside of time, space, and context that can't really be overcome. And so when we think about structural location, it challenges both of those approaches to say that this is a material relationship. It has a context, it has a historicity, and therefore it can be overcome. So.
Yeah, I think that's so important too. And it, kind of to one of the things as I was thinking about it, especially this time, right, is thinking about like, even in this particular moment that, for instance, Palestinians have a structural location within the world system, within US imperialism and so on, right? And so it's also might help people understand who can't quite get it, like, why is it that this specific cause, like nobody, that basically it's constituted as oppositional to U.S. foreign policy or something like that,
Yeah. So in the Palestinian case, it would be like how I say this is not reducible to caste, class, or race, basically. In the Palestinian case, it's not reducible to religion, right? There is a religion aspect to it. It's not reducible to religion. It's not reducible to Orientalism, although Orientalism is part of it. It has a material reality, it has a structural relationship, it has a history, right? And so that is really important. It's not just because the US hates colonized people, which it does, but it's not reducible to that we have to pay attention to imperialism and capitalism and material realities to really understand the Palestinian situation.
Yeah, appreciated. So as your work demonstrates, anti-communism is a very broad category. It's not just a category that targets communists or even communist anarchists and revolutionary socialists, although it does certainly target those groups. In fact, anti-communism opens up a much broader array of organizations and individuals to being targeted for their activism or their advocacy or their speech or even their beliefs. And as a result, you talk about, what is meant, what this meant, right, for their, so-called rights or liberties of people within that the government defined as communist or adjacent. You can talk about, there's some groups that are, historically seen as adjacent and so on, in the hands of the state. So talk about this a little bit in the ways that you think about the counter subversive legacy, in the eras you write about with this concept of anti-communism.
So it's effectively, anti-communism is like a weaponized, or communism in the context of anti-communism becomes like a weaponized synecdoche. Synecdoche, right? SYNECDOCHDE. You might not have known it was spelled like that, and I've just spelled it wrong. Synecdoche. Yeah, that's how you spell it. SYNECDOCHE. But what that is it's when the part stands in for the whole. So what that means is that communism, which is one articulation of a whole bunch of radicalisms, anti-imperialisms, counter-hegemonic forms of thought and action, but it becomes the way to refer to all of this stuff, which does a number of things. One is that it distorts differences in radicalisms and the sort of, and also because it scoops into the dragnet like liberals and other people who are not probably not radical. provides a fundamental distortion of what radicalism actually is and the importance of ideology and differences in action. The second thing that it does is that it makes people who might be construed as communist or communist adjacent, it makes them quite reactionary. And so they do the work of the state often, or of the anti-radicals, by trying to distance themselves from radicalism and to couch whatever their beliefs or activism are in terms that will disallow them from being associated with communism or whatever the radical threat is. But the point is that it's impossible. You can't do it because the very constitution of communist as a synecdoche means that everything is encapsulated in that. And so we see this happen with wokeism, right? It's the same type of logic. Cultural Marxism, which doesn't actually mean anything, but it means a lot of things to these people, right? Or DEI. And so all of these are part of this sort of anti-radical, anti-communist nexus because they are all meant to sort of to criminalize, discredit, or distort belief in racial equality, right? Any semblance of economic democracy, internationalism, international solidarity, anti-imperialism, all of these things become seen as like anathema to the state. And so it uses one threat to construct a dragnet against every threat. And so a contemporary example is that the attack on the encampments and the demonization of the pro-Palestinian protests as terrorism was the opening to attack DEI, right? And there are many discourses that went into the attack of DEI, right? These not only undesirables, but undeservings are getting into higher education. That higher education produces this extreme leftist radical thought that the professors are not to be trusted, and that because this milieu has been fomented through DEI, this is what created the conditions for these criminals to come on our campus and tear it up and disturb the peace and engage in anti-Semitism, whatever that means, right? And so I think that those are ways that you can see how anti-communism morphs over time and shifts, but it also stays relatively durable. So communism still is a thing. Anti-communism still is a thing, but it also becomes a sort of foundation for these other like anti-terrorism, anti-Semitism type discourses that use the exact same logic.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot of, I think, how we get here, right, to this place where all these different types of organizing or thought can be like then thought of as threats, or the whole language of subversion, which I actually wanted to say I really appreciated in your book, thinking about, like, obviously we do a lot of talks on counterinsurgency and so on, but I love the language of counter subversion that you use through your text, because really very often that's what it is. They're not even for something to be counterinsurgency, it implies that there is some kind of insurgency that is actually taking hold and is being combated, whereas most often they're trying to combat it because they're afraid it will become an insurgency, and they do that at the level of where they think it's subversive, right? And so yeah. So let's talk about peace. I always love hearing you talk about peace and the way that you kind of describe it and think about it. But you write about how this poses a really specific problem for Wall Street imperialism. So, both in the period you're talking about, but also today. So maybe you could also say a little bit about what Wall Street imperialism is, because that's a term you use throughout your book that I also really appreciate the kind of precision of it.
Yeah, so Wall Street imperialism is a term that comes from like the communists. They use this term. So, reading like Claudia Jones and Harry Haywood and a bunch of other people, they talk about Wall Street imperialism, and it's effectively a relationship between basically financial capital, imperialist interests in the state. So that's kind of what Wall Street imperialism is. It's a way that it's like, we call it now, we normalize it through like public-private partnership, but effectively what it is the ways that the interests of capital coalesce with those of the state and imperialism and are quite often driven by private interests, right? Harnessing the state to to use carrot and stick methods to spread markets, to extract surplus value, to exploit labor and expropriate. So that's what Wall Street imperialism is. And then I have a much more detailed definition about sort of how it relates to national oppression, how it structures the relationship between the U.S. North and South, and other things. But that's effectively what it is in a general sense. And so, in terms of peace, so in a war-driven, racially hierarchical political economy, peace is a death knell for profit. It's really that simple. And for the United States, peace is a particular type of order, right? It's a particular type of ability to penetrate markets and to impose its conception of democracy and security. That is what peace is. Peace is this sort of imposition of a particular type of security. Anything that does that sort of contravenes that becomes like a Soviet plot or a China plot or whoever the enemy du jour is for the United States. And so, a contemporary example of this is, a couple of years ago, the New York Times did a hit job on like the People's Forum and Code Pink and a bunch of other organizations, because they ostensibly are funded by China, right? Chinese influence. And they linked all of these different organizations and entities to like this one funder to argue that, these organizations and entities are spreading like Chinese propaganda and are acting on behalf of China. And it was primarily sort of anti-war, like peace work. So at the time, people were protesting the war in Ukraine. They're protesting, ongoing bombing of Yemen and ongoing bombing of Somalia. All of these ways that the U.S. is waging war, both regular and irregular warfare, unilateral. So sanctions, for example, like they're critiquing all of this war making and warmongering that the U.S. is doing, and to have this conception of peace is to be foreign influenced, and of course, organizing for peace. It's all the things that the U.S. is hostile to. So internationalism, anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, militancy, so taking to the streets in various ways, and then organizing. So organizing is actually quite. The U.S. is historically hostile to that, right? This idea, because of liberal individualism, this idea that if you are in an organized group where people have discipline or move together, then they are contravening like liberal individualism. They're susceptible to groupthink or to some foreign influence. And so peace is really, it embodies all of these things that the U.S. sees as subversive, as a threat to its national security.
Yeah, I mean, and another current example is the way that they try to link pro-Palestine activists to either Hamas or to Iran, right? As like these are entities that the government has already said are prescribed, essentially, right? And so, it's a similar kind of process. You look at a number of anti-radical and anti-communist committees in your book quite extensively, in different chapters of the book. And one is the Fish Committee. So I was just going to read a paragraph from your book here on the Fish Committee. So the Fish Committee report maintained that times of economic crisis and social suffering created ideal conditions for the spread of communism. And it proposed, drastic legislation to eradicate it and subversive activities more broadly. The report suggested anti-communist collaboration between all three branches of government, including a spy service in the DOJ, the deportation of alien Reds, a federal sedition act, and the suppression of communist literature through the Postal Service. The Postal Service shows up a number of times in this book, too. It's really important for us.
That's how they got Garvey.
Yeah.
Mail fraud.
Continuing on, one conclusion to be drawn from this contrast, the negligible influence of communism on the one hand, but the recommendation of broad-based measures to crush its influence on the other hand, is that because U.S. capitalist racist society was predicated on the very conditions conducive to the spread of radicalism, anti-communism aimed to repress opposition to racial and class antagonism instead of transforming oppressive and exploitative conditions. So, end quote. So first, I read this section because it shows how multifaceted this state repression and how much they're thinking about all of these different levers at once of like, these are all the things we're going to do. And this was in 1930. And I know you go further back, you look in the around 1917, 1920s as well. And I just thought it was a good synopsis of the kind of various levers or weapons that they use, various targets of these committees, including things like literature and using the postal service to stop the spread of it. But there's a larger point you're making here as well as about why the US doesn't seek to transform conditions, and you go on to talk further about what that means. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about these 2 points, about the kind of all the levers of government or weapons of anti-communism the state uses, and we could say more broadly kind of anti-radicalism, right? Because you're thinking about communism also and anti-communism quite capaciously in the book, but also why also why they took that approach as opposed to ameliorating the conditions that produced communist, anarchist, or black radical thought.
Yeah. So there's all kinds of things. In that moment, they had there was a lot of listings, so it came to be known as like blacklisting. It can be called red listing, right? So the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations having to register with the Subversive Activities Control Board. They used to print these. I have a bunch of them, print out these government documents that had lists of all of these organizations, and there are like hundreds of these organizations that are ostensibly communist front or that are subversive, that had to register with the Subversive Activities Control Board. They use these congressional committees, and the congressional committees, you're sort of damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. If you do testify and you participate, then you are sort of just even being called before the committee is seen as an admission of guilt, basically. Then if you refuse to testify, like if you plead the Fifth Amendment, then you're called a Fifth Amendment communist. And so what that shows is that the laws don't really apply to you. You don't have freedom of speech. You don't have due process. The Fifth Amendment doesn't apply to political minorities. People who are considered to be subversive. So there's like that whole apparatus. And we're also seeing this again when the presidents of like Penn and Columbia and these other organizations were called before Congress. It's a similar type of logic, because no matter what they said, it was not going to be enough, right? They're never going to find these people were doing enough on their campuses because the encampments were already happening. And so, and the pro-Palestine sentiment was already there. And so it's a way to assert criminality in ways, the committees allow the circumvention of the law, basically, to construct criminality or guilt or subversion. There is, a whole bunch of legislation that I mentioned. There is these various executive orders. So there's all of these different ways. And then by creating this sort of chaotic atmosphere of repression, then people start to self-regulate. People start to, interpolate themselves into the repression. And so again, we see this with colleges and universities that even if they might have lost no money. They might be doing very little about DEI, but they are willing to take things off their website, to do even less about DEI, right? They're doing all of these preemptive things in order to try to protect themselves. And so then there becomes a sort of societal anti-radicalism that people are engaging in to try to save themselves, even though it just never ever works. Like nobody is ever safe. Like look at Colombia, they capitulated to all of these demands by the government. The government still didn't give them that money back, and I think is removing even more, right? And so it's actually quite crazy. And in terms of why the state uses these weapons instead of ameliorating the conditions, that is because to ameliorate the conditions would be to self-annihilate, right? To self-obliterate. It would mean land back, some form of reparations to nationally oppressed people and those subjected to Western imperialism, the overthrow of white supremacy, and more. So all of the foundations, right? The overthrow of property relations, that is the only way you really can satisfy those conditions. The very founding of this nation, that is to say, the foundations of a capitalist, racist settler colony, make it that's a baked in contradiction. It makes it impossible to prevent the radicalism that is going to ultimately be a response of a majority to plurality of the people who are ostensibly citizens being subjected to various forms of exclusion, discrimination, oppression, and subjection. But on the other hand, right, the complete eradication of racialized populations is impossible, given the necessity of super exploitation and super profit to the reproduction of the system. And that's another reason, by the way, that I use structural location of Blackness, because it's about the forms of super exploitation, super profit, and expropriation that are actually reproductive of the system. Like, classical Marxism may or may not pay attention to these realities because of population or all sorts of other, they don't pay attention to imperialism, all sorts of things, but it's actually really important. And so Cory Booker's Spectacle is an example of why all three branches of government sort of work together to use these techniques and these tools to reproduce the system in a way that is mollifying. So we want people to look to Cory Booker and the whatever, his PP performance, whatever the fuck he was doing. He had to have a Depends on. Ain't no way that one can go for 24 hours. But anyway, whatever, right? So people look to that as a sort of legitimate form of fight back, when really it's just reproducing the system, when really he is protesting in Congress, when it is through primarily the executive branch and these executive orders that much of the current form of repression is happening. And so one doesn't need to ameliorate the conditions when you have these liberals, when you have people who actually believe in this system. They just want a system that only represses like absolute others, right? Whether it's political minorities or racial minorities or whatever else. And so as long as you have those people who believe in America, then, just keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah, they make it. Unfortunately, I get more and more frustrated by those folks every day. So one of the things that we and actually this speaks a little bit to a question that Eric asked a little bit ago that I starred. Let's see, speaking to the idea of the outside agitator. So we're going to kind of get there here, but we can speak to that specifically as well. But one of the things that we're seeing mobilized again in this moment is the notion of dangerous ideas coming from foreign sites, and this is one of the pretexts being used to target visa holders and green card holders. Mahmoud Khalil was just deported, actually, or not. I don't know that he's been deported yet. There's been an order to push for his deportation. I don't, there may still be a legal proceeding or something along those lines. But I'll even share my screen real quick and just let folks, if they missed this. So this was a memo issued by Marco Rubio, and kind of the key components here really is this last section. An alien is deportable from the United States if the Secretary of State has reasonable ground to believe that the alien's presence or activities in the United States would have potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences for the United States. For cases in which the basis for this determination is the alien's past, current, or expected beliefs, statements, or associations that are otherwise lawful, the Secretary of State must personally determine that the alien's presence or activities would compromise a compelling U.S. foreign policy interest. So, obviously solidarity to Mahmoud and to everyone else, who is struggling around, the being targeted around the immigration system and so on right now.
So let me just clarify something here, right? So this idea that he's being deported for beliefs, that is technically true, but not actually. What he's being deported for is action. And so what legislation like the McCarran-Walter Act, or even the current statute under which he's being deported, is saying is that you can believe what you want. You can't do anything about it, right? And so it is punishing. It's like activism. It's punishing organizing. It's punishing sort of protest. So it is ideas per se, but it's more so punishing action and acting on those ideas.
Absolutely. So, but just to finish up this question, so, we're seeing, obviously we saw a couple weeks ago or a week ago, I don't know what time is at this point, but a whole bunch of people that were called Venezuelan gang members, many of them were not, but whatever. And that's the pretext, right? That's being used. And, this week they were floating the ideas of sending US citizens. They said sort of the worst of the worst to El Salvador's CECOC, which is the Terrorism Confinement Center. And so in your book, just to give an example of something that you're talking about in the book, there's a couple of people that you really talk about, Marcus Garvey as well as Claudia Jones, and around, their status. And you actually write quite a bit also really interestingly about Caribbean radicals and like the specific threat that they were seen to pose in this era. But you use Claudia Jones as like one of the paradigmatic examples of how the state dealt with the red, black, black, red in her case. She was from Trinidad, through the immigration system. And there are other examples as well, of course. I think one of the questions this begs is kind of what is the threat of foreignness or foreign influence in a country that often prides itself on being a nation of immigrants, right? And conversely, maybe we could talk in this a little bit about true Americanism. And you write also about America First as kind of a new iteration of this.
Yeah, so I mean, the threat of foreign influence or foreign inspiration is that people who are deemed foreign or have like foreign ideas, the threat is that they can't be properly indoctrinated or acculturated into U.S. values. And then in terms of foreign influence, it's this fear of interference, right? Of somehow being able to capture the hearts or minds of otherwise loyal citizens and trick them into doing things that are against the state. What's particularly ironic about that is that the US is doing this everywhere, all the time, through soft and hard power. They are always trying to influence other people to overthrow their governments, to right, to take up these fake ideals of US democracy and freedom. Excuse me. And so, or perhaps, like they say, hit dog holler. The fact that the United States is always doing that elsewhere is why they have this particular fear here. And also, right, that is the sort of contradiction of being a sort of a nation of immigrants, is that you need these people to work, but then they're supposed to come as empty vessels and not have any beliefs or any culture or any way of being in the world that will preclude them from taking on like an American identity, right? And so this sort of anti-foreignness is really, it's like a fear of collectivism, cooperation, forms of care and community in other parts of the world that are like wholly antithetical with the profits over everything US model. And so it really is it's a suspicion of people who want to work together, who might want to live together, who might want to organize their families in a particular way, who might want to have a union, right, to be represented, who want to be labor militants, or who want to engage in militant action against the owners of capital. They might not even be anti-capitalist. They just want a better deal. They want to make us a living wage or have better working conditions. That all of these things that, the United States not only wants to oppress people, but it wants you to thank them for that oppression. It wants you to be grateful for that oppression, right? That is basically what the crux of anti-foreignness is. And with respect to what true Americanism is, or America First, is sort of a belief in capitalism. It's effectively a belief in white supremacy, right? Or at least a willingness not to challenge it. The sort of triple K, which is like, church, kitchen, and children for women, and in general, no unions, no organizing, and the imposition of the sort of pretense of equality through the congealing of hierarchy, meaning equality of opportunity, even though it's not even that, but right. But what the basis of equality of opportunity is that well, everybody theoretically can do whatever they want. And whatever hierarchies emerge or whatever forms of oppression or disadvantage emerge are the fault of the people who didn't work hard enough. And so therefore, if you talk about classes, if you talk about different forms of segmentation, you are going against this idea of the U.S. ideal of egalitarianism, or the U.S. ideal of non-domination. And so basically for the United States, as I said earlier, peace means a particular type of order and no dissent, that sowing any dissent or any confusion or any protest is subversive, right? It's meant to undermine what the methods, aims, and objectives of the U.S. state are.
Right on. Thank you. So another important lesson in this book is that being anti-communist doesn't save folks, right? And so it doesn't save Marcus Garvey or Benjamin Fletcher. And conversely, you also show that, like, being anti-Garveyite or being anti-Pan-Africanist or, revolutionary Black nationalist doesn't save communist folks either, or socialist agitators either, because to the state, doesn't like any of us, basically. So what lessons do you glean from that? And you quote this term, or you use this term, negotiating the terms of our own immiseration. So how do we avoid negotiating the terms of our own immiseration? I think that's an important question for times like this.
Yeah, I think that we have to kill the pig, the liberal, and the anti-radical inside ourselves, first and foremost, because like this glee or cheering on of the repression of another organization, even if we disagree with their ideas, is dumb as hell. Is strengthening the very apparatus that will ultimately come for you. This was my caution during the 2020 moment, where people are like reveling in the firing of these fucking these racists or people who are deemed racist or whatever, because it's like, when you celebrate that kind of, like, first of all, like corporate power or individualized power to like impose the will on somebody and prevent them from making a living, this is an anti-radical country. It's ultimately going to come back on you, right? When we have the cancel culture, aspects of cancel culture that I think did pervade, this is what's happening with pro-Palestine activists on steroids, because it's not only going to be a social thing. The right wing has the power of the state. They have the monopoly on violence and on political power. And so it's going to come back in stunning fashion. And it did. And it will continue to do so. And so it's the same type of thing that we really, like, we cannot be sort of carceral in our understanding. We can't let state domination or repression stand in for effective organizing. Like, we have to. So this is sort of what I was saying. Instead of like, students or people wanting to get racist professors fired, it's like, organize and boycott their courses, because ultimately they will lose their job or they will not get paid if nobody takes their classes. Their classes will be canceled. Like, there's organized, people-centered ways to beat out the punishment we want to see that doesn't have to celebrate like a militarized, pig, repressive ethic. It's not to the benefit of any of us, right? And so, related to that is like, we cannot afford sectarianism. Like, we make our jokes about the trots or the anarchists or whomever, but like, no one is winning. No one has the solution. We cannot even organize to stop a genocide. So anybody who's walking around, any sort of organization or ideology or sect that's walking around with their ass on their shoulders, why? We're not winning. We have perhaps begun to win the battle of ideas, perhaps, but we are not materially, we can't stop shit. And so we can't afford the sectarianism. We should be leading with the spirit of political humility, mutual comradeship, and collaboration as much as possible. And this is easier said than done because we're acculturated into a alienated, hyper individualized, non-profitized form of organizing and movement, but we don't have time, and if we look at these historical lessons, if we look at the ways that these groups turn on each other to the detriment of everyone, I think those are really important lessons to learn. And then we can engage in principle critique, right? But there's a difference between principle critique and gossip, right? There's a difference between principle critique and this like taking the social media and say, you know, and calling shit out in way without presenting an alternative, number one, or number two, in ways that really don't understand the current correlation of forces. So, you know, these things have real, like people are really getting deported. People are really getting arrested. People are, you know, really losing their jobs. They're really, you know, being surveilled. These things happen, and we don't want to add to those realities through our own misplaced like celebration of state logics.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point always. But even, you know, it takes on even a bigger scale in, you know, times like these. And I think, again, your book shows like really concrete historical examples of like, you know, it's not sectarian is not new, you know, and it's been there even at times when the movements have been larger and more powerful. And but you know, there's a lot of examples of people that we look up to on, you know, from different political backgrounds that actually worked with the state or whatever against somebody they didn't like, you know, and you know, there's dire consequences for those things. And so
Beat them
you know,
up, like learn how to fight, do something. Like whatever. Okay, yeah, you know, violence. It's like don't do that shit. That's so dumb. The state is never your friend. It's never on your side. It's gonna use you up, chew you up, and spit you out. Like don't do that.
yeah. All right, so let's talk a little bit about America First and true Americanism. We said something about it already, but it feels like you know, we're seeing kind of two, I guess what I would say is there's kind of two different versions of true Americanism that I see in this moment, or I would say is one is, you know, the right version, I mean, they're both right to me, but you know, the Republicans and kind of Trump discourse. But I would also argue, as you kind of laid out with the Cory Booker thing earlier, that the Democratic Party and, you know, as you mentioned earlier, the hands-off protests include something like hands-off NATO, but not, you know, no mention of Gaza or Palestinians or Yemen, right? Or Venezuela, Cuba, Congo, Haiti, for that matter, right? And so how do we, you know, move, I guess, yeah, I mean, the question is, how do we move beyond this binary? I know that's a big question that's imposed by Wall Street imperialism, but what are your thoughts on this, on the kind of multiple forms or discourses of a kind of true Americanism in this moment?
I don't think it's a binary. It's just a spectrum. Like there's like, you know, I don't even know if those are polls. Those just might be in different places on the spectrum. There's probably like an even more liberal version, which like, you know, FBA, right? Foundational Black Americans might be another articulation of that, but I just see them as a spectrum and that they mutually constitute. You know, so not being one or the other strengthens the other. So it's like, you don't want to be a liberal, you want to be, you know, be a conservative and do all of the, you know, whatever, have 1 million babies and do, you know, stay at home and sew all your clothes. Or you have like, you don't want to be a Trumper. So, you know, support NATO, support our military, support USAID, support US imperialism, with a few more chips in the cookie, right? Those are like a spectrum of the same type of discourse. But the way to get over it is to disidentify with America, with this whole American project, right? And we can reject repression. We can reject what's happening with the current administration. We can reject what's happening with the last administration without taking up some weird patriotism or like, this isn't the America I know. This is the fucking America, you know, like what planet are you on? Like, I really don't understand, you know, and I had a brief back and forth with, I believe his name is Eric Lee. He's Momodou Taal's lawyer, where he's like, I don't recognize this America where somebody like Momodou can be deported. And I'm like, You mean the America with like the Chinese Exclusion Act and, you know, the Internal Security Act of 1917 and the Espionage Act of 19, you know, the Internal Security Act of 1950, the Espionage Act of 1917, the Patriot Act. Like, so what do you mean that? So what is your America? What is the America you recognize? I just really don't understand what that discourse is. And so when I say disidentify with the United States or with America, that means we have to, as I always say, number one, believe our own analysis, but number two, make hard decisions. And it's like, if you have options, like now is when we exercise our principles. If we purport to be a movement, we purport to be for the people, now is a time to exercise that. And so I think that making those tough decisions every day is how we disidentify and how we get beyond this, you know, whatever kill the true American in you, right? Be an untrue American, I guess. I don't know. Be African. I'm African.
Not all of us have that luxury.
Be Irish, Scott, German, whatever.
There you go. Yeah. But so actually, there's one piece I wanted to talk to you about a little bit in the book, was that you talk about how, and this is through.
Hold on, give me 1 second. Let me go grab some.
Yeah.
I'll be right back.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
All right.
Hey.
Here she is. Hello. All right.
So one of the there's a quote where you talk about, or where you're quoting that the true Americanism created the special conditions that had blocked the development of an American Marxist tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was specifically interesting. You know, because there's always this idea, or this there's often a desire to create an American Marxism or an American communism. And I don't know if you see those two things as, I mean, your book suggests to me that you see those things as kind of antithetical, America and Marxism. But I don't know if that's what you were getting at there, or if you have thoughts on that point.
So part of my dissertation is about this, that like with the advent of American studies, which is like the sort of, it started as American civilization studies, there was a way of understanding the United States vis-a-vis Europe, primarily through cultural terms. And this becomes the basis of like our scholarship and our analysis. And so instead of class, we talk about socioeconomic status, or if you went to college or not. This becomes our class analysis, right? It becomes all of these sort of abstracted terms that are predicated on a refusal to engage a ruling class and a working class, right? A ruling class and a proletariat. And it's part of that sort of language that the US puts forth about this sort of egalitarianism, that yes, there are different classes, but they're effectively equal because there's equality of opportunity. And so this becomes the basis of how we understand. So we talk about what Oliver Cox would call about social class, but not political class. So, and it precludes a Marxist analysis, because the social scientists, right, are part of universities that are institutions that are meant to that are, you know, the function is class reproduction. The function is to reproduce the liberal bourgeois like status quo. And so there are people in the United States who have been real Marxists, but I don't know what an American Marxist would be. I mean, Americanism and Marxism are antithetical, but the American Marxism that we had, right, is like, that's where you get this Pat So shit, the patriotic socialism, or under Earl Browder, when he's talking about, like, you know, this whole Americanist discourse, it becomes like a distortion. It makes you disavow imperialism and class against class and that type of thing. And so I think that's preferential to people in this country, because it allows us to continue to fundamentally misunderstand where we are, which allows everybody to think they're middle class, even when, you know, You don't have a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of. It allows everybody to think that, with just the right moves, you can be a millionaire or a billionaire. That's that sort of wishful thinking stands in for a desire to struggle for real material progress.
Yeah, no, it's a great answer. All right, somebody said they want to learn more about Wall Street imperialism so they can explain it to their neighbors better. Any suggestions? I mean, read the book. That's what I would say. But.
Yeah, I would say read the book first, and then if you have questions, read Claudia Jones. So there's a collection. Oh, you don't have it up there, but there's a collection by Carol Boyce Davies called Claudia Jones Beyond Containment. You have the Buzz Johnson one, but
yeah, I have Left of Marx behind me too, but yeah, I don't have that.
Yeah,
one.
but that essay collection, Claudia Jones talks quite a bit about Wall Street imperialism and breaks it down. So the role of Wall Street imperialism, for example, in the Marshall Plan, and like we're brought up to believe that Marshall Plan is like this good thing, a reconstructed Europe, but it's actually quite a repressive form of legislation that conscripted Europe into like U.S. market orbit and funded, the reconstruction of West Germany and fascist in Greece and a whole bunch of other shit. And so those are places. Yeah. And then if it's still like unclear, just maybe we can have more conversations. But I think there's a pretty good explanation in the book.
Right on. So a couple other how do we overthrow white supremacy, and what does real decolonization mean? Any thoughts on either of those questions?
I mean, I think these are not necessarily. These
might not be YouTube live conversations.
Yeah, these are questions to ask your organizations. I think that these questions require collective answers, collective ideating and struggle, so collective praxis. So I'll just punt in that way. Real decolonization in this country means land back. You have to give the land back to indigenous people. That there is literally no other decolonization in this context without land back, because it is fundamentally a settler colony, and people try to evade that reality because ostensibly the colonization was complete. The colonization is ongoing, right? The primitive accumulation, as it were, is ongoing, and until indigenous folks are given back their land to steward and to share the way that they see fit, then there's no decolonization project.
Can you talk a little bit about the term capitalist racism and how it intervenes with Cedric Robinson's racial capitalism?
Yeah, it's just interrogating anti-Black racial oppression in particular. That is a function of the capitalist mode of production, basically. Cedric Robinson argues for a sort of a long, what we might call a long duree understanding of racism that emanates from like the feudal order, and that just gets sort of globalized through capitalism. I don't necessarily share that perspective. I think that there are historical moments in modernity that create what the racial logic that shapes capitalism, or that comes to sort of be entwined with capitalism. And so that's sort of what I mean by capitalist racism. It also takes seriously like war as a primary feature, war and ongoing primitive accumulation as primary features of the conjuncture of capitalism and racism. That's basically what it means. If you want to use racial capitalism, I don't care. Like I don't have a dog in the fight. It's just a specific way of thinking through the connections between racial hierarchy and capitalist exploitation.
Yeah, I mean, my take on this has been that one, Robinson doesn't write a whole lot about what he means by it. I actually think like Forgeries of Memory and Meaning is a better book to understand how he thinks that capitalists use racism to recalibrate their system and to put different groups into subjection at different times based on what's needed structurally in terms of imperialism and so on. And I think
that's a conceptual analysis though, right? So like if you read like Josh Myers on this, he's thinking about terms of order. right? It's not really political economy. Like, I'm trying to think about political economy. It's not to say he doesn't think about political economy, but that's not his project. So my project is like the political economy of like racial subjection and the racialization of political economy.
Yeah. I mean, I think Forgeries has a lot of political economy in it, but it's not a book of political economy. But yeah, I hear you. All right, question. So here's a dangerous one. What does it mean to truly decolonize oneself? Nothing? Anything?
To decolonize the self. I mean, I think that so this, I mean, I'll answer it in this way. So I often I'm critical of like this whole like decolonize the university. It's like, I don't think you can decolonize the university until you decolonize the land, but you can make decolonial moves. And so that means paying attention to how you relate, like ethically, what are the politics in which you engage? Who are you responsible and accountable to? What are the ways that you engage, the contradictions and antagonisms that are inevitable in this society? So I just think that acting, in a way that is people-centered, that is to the best of your ability, not reproducing imperial, colonial, and oppressive logics in your everyday interactions, whether you interact with yourself, with others, and with, our various ecologies. Yeah.
For sure.
Somebody asked that. Didn't somebody have an outside agitator question?
Yeah, we could talk about that. I have some thoughts too, but you go ahead.
Oh, yeah, no, please.
Well, like one of the interesting things for me in thinking about this is even back before, like, so I think it'd be interesting. You could talk about it really. And I mean, I'm sure you have lots of thoughts about it, but like you write about it in the book. But one of the instances of this that's interesting to me is that Gerald Mullen writes about this in a book called Flight and Rebellion. But slave owners in the South would refer to enslaved people who would run away basically as outlandish, right? And like what they meant is that they didn't want to be subjected because it wasn't what they, they hadn't been acculturated into withstanding, and so they would just run away. And it sometimes led to insurrection, but often it just led to, I'm gonna get the fuck out of here, and go live off the land. And so the point being is like that idea of, I mean, even the series Outlander, although I'm not recommending it, but like that there's within Euro societies, there's like a long tradition of these people come from somewhere else and they're not assimilating into our society. And assimilation is a kind of, as you were talking about it earlier, of accepting terms of subjection that are really quite awful. And so there's this long history, really, I think, that's always kind of been there of, people who just, they don't assimilate or they don't want to be a part of this society, and their ways, right? I mean, even there's a lot of emphasis on godless people, and all of this stuff within like kind of European liberal thought of just people, masterless people who won't accept whether it's feudalism or whatever else. And so I think that there's a specific history of it that definitely comes in once you get to like the anti-communism and everything else. But there's also a kind of, in my view, like a longer history of just, European settlers being pissed off that, indigenous people or black people wouldn't accept what the really messed up system that they were trying to put those folks into. And so there's always kind of been a fear of, or a struggle around people who are seen as foreign or outside or not used to our ways, kind of thing.
So to me, an outside agitator is a little bit different than like, it's not linked to foreignness. It's more so somebody who comes from elsewhere to foment dissent. So this could be very much a free Black person coming to the South to encourage enslaved Africans to run away, or it could be carpetbaggers, right, that are coming from the North and ostensibly sewing up, like riling up the Blacks, right? So outside agitators are people, yeah, and we heard this discourse all throughout 2020. We hear it all the time. It's like, you know, people are coming literally from elsewhere to the Twin Cities to destroy property, to turn otherwise peaceful demonstrations into these violent uprisings. And so it's this idea that social relations are fine, things are amicable and, you know, orderly until somebody from elsewhere who has a stake in sowing dissent or chaos or anarchy or rebellion comes and with sort of an outside perspective that doesn't belong in a particular place. And so it's a way of constructing like these insides and outsides to evade responsibility. Like, no, the reason why Black people are uprising or running away is not because somebody came elsewhere and told them. It's because they're unfree, they're enslaved, right? The reason why people are rising up and burning things down in Minneapolis is not because some organized cabal came from elsewhere and told them to do that. Is because people have reached a flashpoint with respect to police murder of ordinary fucking people and the ways that and how the function of police is to protect private property. Right. And so it is true. And then it's also, again, it's a critique of organization. It's a critique of solidarity, because if somebody comes from elsewhere to contribute to a thing, then they don't belong. Right. That this is outside agitation. It's not solidarity. Right. So if you know, we saw this with the discourse about the encampment, that people are coming from the community. These outside agitators are coming and stirring up our otherwise orderly and well-behaved students. So it's always somebody out there who has these nefarious intentions who is coming to hear that is already set, that is already sort of codified in a particular way and disrupting that order.
Yeah, that's great. All right. Couple more questions, and then Sankara, I'll let you get back to your mommy. I know we're being rude right now. All right. So this one I think is fairly easy, but it's an important distinction, I think, to some degree. So is there a difference between decolonized, decolonial versus anti-colonial?
So anti is against and D is not, or to undo. So anti-colonial is like against colonialism. Decolonize is to upend the sort, or deracinate colonialism. That would be the difference.
There's also, I guess I would just say, a difference. There's a kind of academic difference in that, like, a lot of the decolonial studies literature is stuff that comes about as a critique of the kind of post-colonial, you know, and so this idea that anti-colonial didn't go far enough, and so there are these other things that have to be done as well. And to that end, I mean, we had a conversation with Joma Hinisiren a while ago about that, but you know, there are critiques of decolonial studies as well, you know, that from a kind of Marxist or Maoist perspective, or other, you know, kind of dialectical materialist perspectives that say, you know, there's a lot of reasons why anti-colonial didn't produce like communism in half of the world, or whatever the goal was that people had in their mind, you know, in terms of what decolonization would be. But they, you know, they may or may not be some of the things that fall within, you know, when, for instance, when you said something like decolonize the university earlier on, that like some of the things that get taken up as decolonial or decolonizing may not be as close to what we need to do as like Amilcar Cabral or something like that.
Yeah, there's a different intellectual genealogy too. A lot of the decolonial thought is like a Latin American grounding. So like Walter Mignolo and Anibal Quijano. Although Sylvia Winter is an early decolonial person, and they all came out of that SUNY Binghamton, or not all of them, but there was a SUNY Binghamton thing. I think Carol Boys Davies was involved in that as well. But yeah, and then they deal a lot with epistemology and that type of thing. Like, so there's like, these 12 epistemicides or something that Ramon Groswell-Gill talks about, for example. And so it's a sort of a more systemic, or it's a broader, it's about decolonizing knowledge and power, like all this type of shit. And so which is also, it came out of academia as well as did post-colonial studies, but it's a different, I guess, focus. But I think, anti-colonialism and anti-neocolonialism, as Walter Rodney talks about, and, decoloniality are important.
Yeah, no, I do too. Mm-hmm. All right, last one. And then I just want to plug again, Charisse podcasts with Layla Brown. Check them out all the time on Black Liberation Media. So you can always bring questions there too. So how do you reconcile the tension between building radical movements and the risks of co-optation by liberal reforms or cross-class alliances?
I don't think that's a tension. That's just a reality that organizing always has whatever risk, whether it's co-optation or repression or infiltration. But you can't figure out how to contend with those if you don't build radical movement. Build radical movement and then figure out, think about those things, right? But I think sometimes we get too caught in the weeds about what could happen or what has happened previously, that we don't build radical movement. Build radical movement, and then let's go from there.
Right on. Craig, I'll leave this. One more question. Is there a historical precedent for overcoming fissures on the left? That's a good question. I just wanted to bring this up because I have to get it on the calendar, but I believe we'll have Kamal Franklin on Tuesday to talk about the Black Radical Organizing Conference that folks are putting together for this, is it June, I believe? So we'll be talking about that event as well too. But yeah. Any thoughts on this historical precedent for overcoming fissures on the left?
Well, around the time, like the 1920s, around the time that Marcus Garvey was was arrested and ultimately deported, the Communist Party, who has, had many various critiques of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA, they sort of closed ranks and talked about how deporting Marcus Garvey was an attack on the Black working class and a blow to the movement. Now, people might call this opportunistic. People can say whatever they want, but they put out organized, they organized like protests and shit, and they put out like writings about this. And then Amy Jakes Garvey like lifted up the position they put and sort of expressed appreciation for that solidarity. So there's that example. Yeah. Unity. I don't know. I think unity has to be built. It can't just be assumed. And part of unity, I think what's difficult about like united fronts is that like liberal factions tend to crowd out like the more radical and revolutionary organizers and organizations. And also part of unity means that people who have been detrimental to movement have to admit and atone for that. They can't just be insinuated into any unity process, period. And everybody has to be anti-imperialist, or there's no, I don't know what unity is possible. So.
Yeah, I think that's important. And I think if anything, when I read your book, it's not so, I don't read it so much as a call for unity, but definitely a call not to like not to be, sectarian, feed into the state as a way to solve your grievances or disagreements. And so I think that we can be, I think there can be a principled way that folks engage with each other without always, I mean, more unity I think is good as long as it's principled and it's constructed in a good way. But I don't think sometimes it's not going to happen, and I think that then the question is just, how do we behave ethically, with each other, knowing that the state will use any opportunity to pit us against each other too. So, it just helps them out if we're fighting amongst ourselves.
Yeah. And there could, what is it? Mutual non-combat. And I truly believe if everybody's doing what the fuck they're supposed to be doing, if everybody's doing their work and doing their work, engaging in praxis, which requires, right, theory and action, engaging in criticism, self-criticism, you have fucking time to be worried about anybody else. Like if you're doing your work, you don't have time to be worried about the other 4-person faction. You
Right.
just don't. So like do your work. And what is it? Do no harm, take no shit. It's like, don't worry about what other people are doing unless what they're doing is directly in danger. If you don't, it doesn't matter if you like it or don't like it. Are they endangering you? Are they undermining or preventing your work? If not, be cool. At least start there, right? That's to me the basis of moving towards some type of unity.
Thank you so much. I'm going to let you go. This has been great. I encourage people, please read the book. It is a great time to do so. If you have not already, if you've already read it, it's a good time to revisit it. Check out the work that you're doing at Life Study Revolution. And keep doing the work that you're doing, Charisse. I really do appreciate it. And it's been great to be in conversation with you again.
Likewise, we all love millennials are killing capitalism. So thank you for this platform and thanks for having me. I hope to be back soon.
Absolutely.
Shabbat.
Anytime. Bye.
Yeah, shabbat. All right. Thank you.
All right.